Well, I let me share the presentation that I prepared for you so that we can start a dialogue afterwards about, well, first of all, I will be addressing the impact of the pandemic on the realization of the right to food and nutrition from an international perspective. And then I will be speaking about the future challenges of the right to food, more the structural challenges ahead, which of course are compounded by the pandemic. And of course, speaking about the solutions, it's going to be very important in my presentation today. Okay, so perhaps if we move on to the first question or the first topic of my presentation today, what has been the impact of the pandemic? How do we assess the situation right now? Please, the next slide. Yes, the next one, please. Well, as you know, the current figures on hunger are revealing that we won't be able to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, in terms of eradicating hunger by 2030. So we're doing very badly. Therefore, it's a very serious and concerning situation. Even before COVID, the situation was not good, but now COVID is adding further about 130 million of people that will be affected by the economic recession triggered by COVID. So these are the figures in terms of hunger, but in terms of malnutrition, the figures are also very concerning. So the calculation is that about 3 billion people on Earth cannot afford a healthy diet. And you know that malnutrition is the cause number 1 of the non-communicable diseases, like for instance, diabetes and some forms of cancer and so on and so forth. So it's a very concerning situation for the health of people, but also for the health of the planet. I won't go, I will be addressing later the situation of ecological destruction and collapse, which is also one of the structural drivers of the very concerning situation regarding the right to food. So what we are seeing is poverty is rising in many parts of the world and in many regions, and Asia represents half of the people suffering from hunger already today. So this is like, in terms of global figures, we have a very concerning situation. Next slide, please. Yeah, well, what has been the impact of the COVID-related measures that we have observed on the right to food worldwide? We have been documenting in several countries, about 20 to 30 countries, these impacts, and we have documented it also on a differentiated manner because, of course, different populations are affected in a different way. The first one is what concerns children. Access to food by children has been restricted because of the close down of schools because of confinement measures. And for many children, especially from poor households, school meals were in many cases the main source of food that they had during the day. So this is very concerning, because from a nutritional point of view, you know that access to food for children is extremely important because it determines their further development. We also saw the restrictions on many social assistance programs at food shelters. Of course, this has been somehow governments have reacted to that quickly, but at the beginning there was a closure of social assistance, which was, of course, extremely problematic because many people depend, for instance, on food aid, food banks. Here in my town, even in a country like Germany, the food bank was closed down because it runs on a voluntary basis, and it is mainly elderly women, the ones running the food bank. And you can imagine that elderly women are part of the most vulnerable population to eventually at risk of getting COVID. So this type of disruptions happen also in other countries. It has been, as I said, other ways of organizing food aid was found, but still this disruption because of many problems is observed in many countries. Another very problematic aspect was the closure of peasant markets because of the fear that social distancing and hygienic measures could not be met in peasant markets. I think this disruption is a problem because, again, poorer sectors of the population rely entirely on peasants markets or on informal markets. So it has been reestablished, but still, well, depending on the situation is volatile in many countries. It's quite uncertain and changing fast. So the disruption of peasant markets is also a problem that we have observed. Price speculation, especially because middlemen abuse the situation to speculate eventually, sometimes with the price of inputs, also for the production of food, but also with food itself is another problem that we have observed. The closure of informal markets, this goes rather for the situation of those selling food on the street or on informal kitchens. This is also, of course, a problem. All the jobs that have been lost because of the confinement measures in the entire food sector, kitchens, restaurants, and so on and so forth. This is also a major problem. And then we have the problems with labor, with migrant workers. This is for them, probably this is one of the groups hit the hardest. The situation of migrant workers for themselves, because they are in a very vulnerable situation in many cases. They have just lost their jobs without any social protection measure. And then on the other hand, there is also the shortage of labor to do agricultural works. So this has been also a problem in some countries. Well, confinement of the elderly people. They are, as you know, the most vulnerable population, and it has been a problem in many countries to ensure that their right to food is secured. And the other new, let's say, emerging problems that we are observing are related to the digitalization, for instance, of social security protection, that in some countries cash social programs have been run entirely on a digital scheme. And for, let's say, for elderly people who are not familiar with digital payments and so on and so forth, it has meant that they couldn't have access to food at all because it was completely running completely on a digital scheme. Next slide, please. Yes, well, I think I already mentioned that. So these were, in the previous slide, I mentioned the impact on concrete people, specific groups of the population. Now, in terms of more structural terms, what we have seen is that governments have reacted, have corrected action, for instance, in some cases, reopening peasants' markets or making social security programs more accessible. But in structural terms, what we observed, and this is very concerning, is that governments have actually deepened some of the policies which were in place before, but are very problematic. I think Lakshmi alluded already to the situation related to land grabbing and resource grabbing. I think this continues, and this is extremely problematic. because in some countries, for instance, my own country, Colombia, the confinement has actually been abused by armed actors. So in countries where you have conflict, armed conflict, the pandemic has made the situation even more insecure and has increased the military control of some of these actors over the population. So it's easier now to do land grabbing in some countries. And this is very concerning because these structural policies are being, instead of being reviewed, because we knew before the pandemic that many of these structural policies, like for instance, those facilitating land grabbing, have to be revised. But now what we see is an intensification of these policies. Another very problematic aspect is the regressive measures. In some countries, like for instance, India, environmental protection measures are being dismantled or are about to be dismantled. For instance, the whole environment impact assessments have been suspended in some countries. So this means that some development projects now could move on without a proper environmental impact assessment. So we think that this is a regressive measure. And many of the schemes to support the economy, unfortunately, are discriminatory because they have favored rather big business, big companies, and not small enterprises or small scale, for instance, farming, fishing, and so on and so forth. Please, next slide. Yeah, I think I have already mentioned this, so we can move on. Perhaps another aspect I haven't mentioned yet is the issue that the consumption of ultra-processed products, because food banks or food aid have promoted the consumption of these products. Lakshmi also mentioned, for instance, instant noodles and so on and so forth. This is also very problematic because it's cementing the diets which are already causing lots of diseases, as I mentioned, non-communicable diseases. And we observed that because of the emergency, the promotion and the consumption of these types of foods have been promoted. And this is, of course, a very problematic aspect as well. Please, next slide. Yes, well, what we have been doing as FIAN is, first of all, monitoring the situation, what's going on. And in that sense, I think our moderator kindly referred to the report that the Global Network on the Right to Food and Nutrition joined on December 10th, last December, to talk about the situation in Asia, what has been the impact of COVID on the right to food in Asia. So this is one report that we did in collaboration with our partners in Asia, but we have been doing also this type of reports in collaboration with national human rights commissions in many other countries in the Americas, in Africa, and in Europe as well. So we have started dialogues with the governments and the country. In many instances, it has been very useful in order to rectify some of the measures that I mentioned, like, for instance, closure of peasant markets, to agree with the government what kind of hygienic and social distancing measures can be taken by these informal and peasant markets so that they can continue running. On the other hand, we are also engaged in international policy debates, mainly in the UN Committee on World Food Security and the FIO. There, the situation is a bit complicated and I think frustrating and disappointing because let's say for the FIO, there is no global food crisis, they say. They think that because the global food supply chains continue running, yes, there was some disruption of them, but for them, they don't see the micro disruptions or the disruptions at local level. And I think this is the very problematic part of the pandemic and of the problems that we have seen, that they are mainly at the local level, and when you are just concerned with the global supply chains, it seems to be invisible for them. So this is a discussion, ongoing discussion that we have with FIO. The CFS, the UN Committee on World Food Security, has not been able to decide to, for instance, discuss a policy response to COVID. It continues being a matter of contention, but we very much hope that it's going to be possible to move on with this discussion, because we think that now is the moment to transform industrial food systems towards more sustainability, so that they become also more healthy and just. So therefore, the discussion around the transformation of food systems is very important right now. And I think we are trying to contribute to that discussion at local, at national, at regional, and at international level. Next slide, please. So probably my time is going to be up very soon. So I will go very quickly in terms of the challenges and how this transformation of food systems, what are the most important aspects that this transformation should address. The first one is ecological destruction. I think we all know that COVID itself is an expression of this ecological destruction. We know it's a zoonotic disease, and it was caused by increased deforestation and increased reduction of the spaces for wild species. So we know that we cannot carry on with this type of industrial agriculture that we have been, that many governments have been promoting for some decades now. The other reason is the pollution and the destruction of soil fertility and biodiversity. So we know that this is, we need to move towards an agriculture and a form of food production, of livestock keeping, of fishing, which allows for regenerating nature, for recovering biodiversity, and of course allows for reducing the greenhouse emissions that an industrial agricultural model, which heavily relies on fossil fuel, is causing. So this is a very important aspect of food systems transformation. And here I think we have options, and one of those is agroecological peasant food production. And therefore, we think that transformation of food systems around agroecology is one of the key measures for the future. Next slide, please. Second challenge relates to financialization. We have observed that financialization, well, is the growing power and influence of global finance. You know that many of these investments, which cause land grabbing and ecological destruction, behind these investments, there is a complex web of capital, global capital, which so it's assets funds and hedge funds and many funds. So therefore, and this has increased enormously in the past 2 decades. It affects not only land investments, agriculture, but it also affects housing in cities like Barcelona or Berlin in Europe, for instance. It affects, of course, health and education as well. So it's a systemic problem. And we think that it is very problematic because it's putting the control of essential goods like food, land, water, health and education, as I said, into the hands of a very opaque actors, which are very remote and beyond any type of political or accountability control. So therefore, we think that this phenomenon of financialization, which is related to tax havens, to the inappropriate tax schemes, has to stop. So therefore, it's very important to definancialize or decommodify essential goods, as I said, like land or food. so that we can put the control of these essential goods back as much as possible into the hands, of course, of the communities and of the polities or political structures, national governments, so that people can really realize the right to food, but the right to land, the right to seats, and so on and so forth. Please, next slide, and I think I'm coming now to the end. Yes, the third, and there's still one more to go, challenge is corporate capture. We are seeing that the corporations are taking an increasingly a seat at the table of governance, of resources, be it land or water, but also of policy discussions. You probably have heard about the UN Food Systems Summit, which is supposed to happen this year in September in New York. And this is a UN Food Summit, which is being co-convened by the World Economic Forum together with the UN. The main person organizing the summit, the special envoy of the UN Secretary General, is the president of the African Alliance for the Green Revolution. So you can see that already from the outset, this summit is biased towards corporation and the interests of these corporations represented, for instance, by the World Economic Forum or the World Council Business for Sustainable Development. We think this is very wrong. The UN is taking a biased position. And the UN, with such a position, it's eventually risking to worsening the situation and deepening the problems, because what we need now, the type of food system transformation that we need now, is one that strengthens the public economy, the communal and public economy. So yes, there is a role for the private sector for sure, but what we need to do now is to rebalance the situation and to strengthen the protection of public systems, public infrastructure. We also need public infrastructure for food, for distribution. I think you in Indonesia are also discussing issues of how to transform the food systems in a way that, for instance, the produce at local levels, the surplus produce can be stored in a better way, how to increase resilience of these systems in the light of the ecological collapse and climate change problems. So this is a very concerning part, and I think what we need to do is to reclaim food systems. I think this is the project of food sovereignty, to reclaim the capacity to decide ourselves what type of food systems we want. So therefore, the call for food sovereignty is more important than ever. Next slide is about trade, please. I think the transformation of food systems also imply that we need to rethink trade policies. We have been relying on a concept of food security, which is based on the global market. And now we see that relying on these long food supply chains put us all in a very vulnerable position. So therefore, we need to recalibrate trade. Yes, international trade can be complementary, but it cannot be the center of policymaking. Rather, we need to strengthen local markets, territorial markets, and of course, strengthen trade schemes which are based on human rights, whose main purpose is to fulfill the right to food and nutrition. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.